How to choose peace, love, joy, and joy as a way of life, and to have it be sustainable. And that's really the issue that we're talking about here. And really, this is about the end of suffering. So one of the things that you may have heard when you saw my introduction video was the whole notion that a lot of us have got involved in the spiritual journey, and we've got the knowledge and we've got practices and that, but we're still struggling in terms of a sense of control of our lives. We're struggling around being able to have sustainable relationships or a loving relationship. We're struggling around finances and challenges around security. We're struggling around establishing a sense of our worth and value in the world. And we've done all of this work, but these things still keep popping up. And we're going to be looking at how to have this become this whole idea of peace, love, and joy as a sustainable way of being. And as I said in the video, I think I'm pretty qualified after having spent 40 years on this journey, and 30 of it I was still struggling. And it's only been the last decade where I can say that there's been a real shift in that in terms of where things are going for me. Buddha taught his eightfold path to enlightenment, and Jesus taught his Beatitudes. Now, a lot of people aren't familiar with the Beatitudes necessarily, but they were in the Sermon on the Mount, which was immediately after Jesus had been in the wilderness fasting for 40 days and 40 nights and had gone through the shifts and commitments that he was making. The first things that he spoke in his sermon were essentially 8 statements, but 7 primarily. The 8th one has some doubt as to whether it's authentic, but the 7 statements, which were called Beatitudes, and they're similar in intent. They're not the same, but they're similar in intent as Buddha's Eightfold Path to Enlightenment. And these were their respective methodologies for finding peace and lasting happiness, which Buddha called nirvana and Jesus called the kingdom of heaven. Now, here's what, and the reason I sort of bring both of these to the fore is that these two philosophies are really extensive, and yet they've got, and what's beautiful about them is they've got a very similar sort of rationale for how to end suffering. And it's kind of interesting to think that you've got these two what appear to be very diverse approaches to spirituality, sharing this very core sense of understanding around the actual way of having peace, love, and joy as a consistent way of being. Now, Buddha taught the Four Noble Truths. Okay, so the first of his Noble Truths, and these are in my version of it in Australian English, is number 1 is we suffer. That's the first truth. Number 2, we suffer because of what we desire or what we're attached to. Number 3, we can be free of suffering. And number 4, we can be free through the Eightfold Path to Enlightenment. So we can assume that the Eightfold Path to Enlightenment is about changing what we desire. If the cause of our suffering is because of what we desire, then we would think that that's what the fourth Noble Truth is helping to relieve. Now, you're going to be surprised to hear this, but Buddha, there's no surprise here. What he said was, follow that and you're able to find nirvana, which is perfect peace and happiness. That's basically where you would go. His heaven was perfect peace and happiness. Now, Jesus, he taught exactly the same thing. He just used different words. We live in darkness is the way that he describes the state of suffering. And then in the Sermon on the Mount, he said, we do this because we treasure mammon. So in other words, our desires are associated with this world. Okay, if you remember, there was a scripture there that said you can't serve God and mammon. And so our suffering or our darkness is because we treasure mammon. Then he said we can live in the light. And of course, as he explained right at the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount, we can be free through the Beatitudes. And so if you're able to apply that transformative journey of the Beatitudes, where you would end up with is the kingdom of heaven, which is peace, joy, and righteousness. By the way, we see the word righteousness all the time in the Christian tradition, and its etymology, one of its elements of etymology means purity of heart. So I want you to hold that because we're going to find that word popping up at different times as we go through what we're describing tonight. Okay, so it's really interesting that they were teaching the same sort of thing. Now, in terms of the reason why we suffer, Buddha said we suffer because of the three poisons. And he described the three poisons as ignorance. The second one was avoidance. Once again, I'm sort of using my languaging, but it's a Western interpretation of what was being taught. And the third one was attachment. Now, once again, Jesus taught exactly the same thing in the parable of the sower. He said, we are unable to move beyond our darkness or our suffering because of the seeds that fall on the wayside. He said, that matches with ignorance, and we'll talk about this in a second. The second one was that seeds fall in stony places. So the seeds represent new understanding, new learning, which moves us beyond our suffering. And then the third one was seeds grow amongst the thorns. So if we look at the theme of these, number one is in ignorance and seeds fall on the wayside, we live life habitually, totally unaware of an alternate reality. So in other words, we just keep on doing what we've always done. We've been programmed in our family, in our society, our culture, and globally to turn up a certain way, and that's what we do. And we're in a state of ignorance, and they're the seeds that fall on the wayside. The second one is we become somewhat aware. So in other words, we have more knowledge, we have more information, but we won't make the changes because it's too hard. And so that's avoidance. That's the no thing that people do. And so that's equivalent to the seeds that fall in the stony places. So the roots of the seeds can't get established. And that's what's happening in avoidance. So you've been given the information, but you can't plant it, can't get established. Then you've got the last one, which is attachment, which seeds grow amongst the thorns. Seeds are planted, the roots get established. But what happens is the thorns and the weeds take over. We're aware, we make the changes, but we keep reverting to old habits. In your mind, put your hands up if this is something that you deal with all the time. You've done the spiritual work, you've made the changes, but you keep on finding yourself reverting back to old judgments, frustrations, your mind getting discombobulated, and all of those things going on and on. And so both Jesus and Buddha were saying this is why we suffer, is because of these three things. And so once again, what we can assume is that the way that we're able to move beyond our suffering is to move beyond ignorance, avoidance, and attachment. And what I'll be giving you tonight are some really powerful tools that are helpful in terms of moving you beyond ignorance, avoidance, and attachment. And of course, once we're stuck in that, we keep suffering. Now, hold that, park that just in your mind for a minute. We're going to jump to the 12th to the 14th century, and we're going to have a look at the Cathar. Okay. Now, there's a lot of stuff about the Cathar, and I've written and I've had theories about the Cathar, but in the last couple of years, I've explored a whole new understanding about the Cathar, and I want to share that with you tonight in terms of what it means, and literally gives a whole new understanding of the significance of who these people were and what they were teaching. This is a great painting depicting the Great Schism of 1054. And I really love the fact. So the Great Schism was where the Catholic Church and Eastern Orthodoxy separated in a very, very um, um, horrible way. Nothing of it represented Christian values. And I love the essence of how this picture sort of creates sort of the Catholic version of how they're approaching Christianity on the left, which was books and knowledge. And on the left, on the right, we've got the Eastern Orthodox, and it's a very earthy and down to earth and contemplative thing, quite different. So this map probably gives us the best description. If you have a look at the map there, you'll see what ended up happening is that in 1054, Christianity became two religions. You ended up with the Roman Catholic Church, which is that sort of darker browny orangey colour on the left and sort of coming to the south. And then you had Eastern Orthodoxy. Now, what's interesting is that Eastern Orthodoxy was a much more, what I'm going to call, mystical approach to Christianity in terms of how they approached it. Whereas the Roman Catholic Church was more academic in terms of where it went in what happened with it. And we actually see quite a sort of a difference in their approaches to Christianity emerging during this time. Now, just because the heads of the churches went through this schism and separated themselves out, it didn't mean that the people did. And so Eastern Orthodoxy was being taught, and people were practicing that mystical approach to Christianity all the way through the Holy Roman Empire. But people, and the way that the Catholic Church was approaching Christian was also being experienced in the Eastern Orthodox. So we had this sort of mishmash, and it was just the hierarchy of the churches, the Pope and the Beatitude, the head of the Eastern Orthodox, that were responsible for this split. Down to earth people were still just Christians doing their thing. Now, what became evident by within sort of like 100 years after the schism was that there was still a whole lot of people in the Roman Catholic part of the Holy Roman Empire who were still very closely associated with Eastern Orthodoxy. There were even bishops who were still teaching Eastern Orthodoxy in their churches, in their cathedrals. And this was all within the area of the Holy Roman Empire. And once the hierarchy of the church began to realize that this was happening, they decided that they needed to have people go and try and convert them. And this was particularly strong in the region of southern France, probably more than anywhere else. We see in the area of the Languedoc, which sort of is from Albi and that area in the north, coming down to Toulouse, all the way across to Narbonne, which you can see there. All that area there, there were cathedrals where they were teaching Eastern Orthodoxy even 100 years after the schism. So Saint Bernard was sent out to try and convert the heretics, and they started calling these people heretics because of the fact that they were pursuing Eastern Orthodoxy as opposed to following the line of pure Catholicism. and he didn't do very well. It wasn't particularly successful. So 50 years later, St. Dominic was sent to do the same thing. And there's a famous story where the heretics and he were debating, and he lit a fire and suggested to them that they throw their books into the fire, and whoever was truly holy wouldn't burn. And so this painting is depicting the heretics on the right throwing their manuscripts into the fire, and they're burning, and St. Dominic's put his book into the fire, and it's floating up in air if you have a look in the middle of that painting. And so he sort of was saying, you guys, you're teaching the wrong thing. You need to become Catholics. And once again, he failed. And as it turned out, some of the people that were supporting him were murdered on their way back to Rome. And that was enough to bring out the ire of the Pope, and that was the commissioning or the beginning of what was known as the Albigensian Crusade. So I just want to explain a little bit about Eastern Orthodoxy. I said it's a mystical Christianity. For them, the kingdom of heaven was theosis. That was the word they used, which meant to be one with God. And they had a very, very specific formula for how you achieve theosis. Step number one was purification, and you'd go through a cleansing process. Step number two was illumination, and then step number three was oneness. The Greek word for purification was catharsis, and this is where the nickname cathar came from. The first written reference to using the word cathar was in 1143. So what we have are all of these people in the Holy Roman Empire who are still practicing Eastern Orthodoxy, even though they're living in the Holy Roman Empire. And these people were practicing catharsis. The priests that were in the cathedral were teaching purification, this process of catharsis. And so this was about people really living their lives in a way where they could be living the most pure lives that they could in order to be able to receive illumination, in order to be enlightened is another word that we would use for that. And enlightenment would result in transcendence, which was this oneness with God. So what ended up happening was that all of these people were Christians. They were no different to Catholics, except they were devoted to purification as a way of life. Now, here's what ended up happening. This is a quote from Will Durant in his book, The Age of Faith. They, the Cathar, made the Sermon on the Mount the essence of their ethics. They were taught to love their enemies, to care for the sick and the poor, never to swear, always keep the peace. Force was never moral, even against infidels. Capital punishment was a capital crime. One should quietly trust that in the end God would triumph over evil without using evil means. So here were people that were devoting their lives to this as their way of life. This was their way of living purification. It was this commitment to kindness that saw the Cathar being described even by their enemies as good and holy people. They were typically referred to as the good men and women, bons hommes and bons femmes. So they were called the good men and women. They called themselves the good Christians. Now, what's really interesting was that the people who owned land and owned regions in southern France loved having these people in their communities because they were honest, they were hardworking, industrious people. They had good values and morals. Who wouldn't want to have those type of people as part of their community? And so what we saw was lots and lots of people sort of becoming aligned with this way of existing. day to day. So here's the story of what happened to the Cathar as they became known, these heretics. So we can see this is the area of Albi, Toulouse, Carcassonne, Narbonne, Béziers, all of this area, Foix, Montsegur. These were the areas where the Cathar were quite strongly established in these areas. So in 1208, what ends up happening, I can't see that it's covered in mine, 1208, 1209. Anyone who was deemed to be somebody who was practicing catharsis was expelled from Carcassonne. So they literally had everybody, or they were imprisoned, or they were forced to declare that they were Catholic. But there was a cleansing that took place originally in Carcassonne. What ended up happening was they wanted to have the whole region cleansed, and so the Albigensian Crusade was commissioned in 1209, and it went from 1209 to 1229, and basically the Crusaders who came from northern France made their way through all of these cities and were about forcing people to declare their Catholicism or to be executed, as it turned out. So one of the famous stories is Béziers on the coast there in that picture. When the Crusaders went into Béziers, they couldn't distinguish between who were Catholics and who were Cathar. Well, unless you knew, and what would happen was that the Catholics weren't dobbing in their friends who were Christians just like they were, who were just living a high level of perfection. So the soldiers went back to Armud, who was in charge of the crusade, and sort of, and this is quite a famous quote, and they said, you know, we can't tell the difference between who's Catholic and who's Cathar. And his famous reply was, kill them all. God knows his own. And so literally that's what happened, is that the Crusaders went into Béziers and they killed every man, woman and child over a period of about a week. And there were thousands of people that died as a result of that. Now, what happened, that set a precedent, and that became what happened to lots of villages and places throughout this whole southern Languedoc, this Languedoc region in southern France, was treated in much the same way. Just horrific, the whole notion of what was going on. Of course, it only could be sustained for 20 years. They couldn't keep the cost of maintaining that. So the Inquisition stopped. We still had groups of soldiers who were doing things. Sorry, the Crusade stopped, but in 1233 they started the Inquisition. And so the Inquisition was where people went through villages and through interviewing and questioning and going to a lot more trouble, they would go through the process of identifying who were Cathar, and they were either executed, they could be sent on pilgrimages. What ended up happening, a lot of them, like in Spain, the Inquisition was oriented towards Muslims and Jews were made to wear these very coarse pieces of clothing that had a big Star of David knitted onto the front of them, so people knew they were Jews, and that people were told not to have anything to do with them. The same thing happened with the Cathar. They had to wear these really harsh pieces of clothing made out of coarse material, and they had big crosses on them. And once again, they could live there, but they couldn't get jobs. People couldn't talk to them. They were basically ostracized within their communities. And that went on, the Inquisition, right up until the mid to sort of 3/4 of the way through the 14th century. So 150 years. We see that Inquisition systematically going through, but it went through more places than southern France. I mean, by this stage, northern Italy had lots of similar sorts of people, and we'll talk about that in just a minute in terms of how the Cathar, they were already there, but they sort of became condensed in the region of Milan, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Montsegur, 1244. This is a photo I took of Montsegur. It's a castle on the top of a mountain. You can see it there in the map. It's sort of down in the bottom center there. This was where there were 400 Cathar were besieged by a small army in this castle. Eventually, they ran out of food and water, and they were told that they had to make a decision about whether they would surrender or if and become Catholic, or if they were going to stay committed to being Cathar, they would be corralled and collectively burnt in a fire at the bottom of the mountain. And the historical story is that 200 of the people basically converted to Catholicism, and 200 people were burnt at the bottom of the mountain because they wouldn't sort of make that commitment. They were staying committed as Cathar. What we see happening was that Cathar weren't a religion to start off with, but by this stage, where they've been marginalised as much as they have, they start coming together, and so they're sort of creating their religion by virtue of the fact that they've been ostracised, they've been, and of course, what they're really facing. This is one of the first applications of the word genocide was to the Cathar. And genocide wasn't just about killing people and getting rid of people. It was about getting rid of all their teachings, their manuscripts, anything that they had that actually gave capacity for people to reconnect with what it was that they represented. So genocide was a complete wiping out of who they were. So with what was going on, particularly in southern France, they eventually made their way across into Milan. And the reason they went to Milan is that Matteo Visconti, the Duke of Milan, had been excommunicated by the Pope. He was about to commission a crusade against the Milanese, but he couldn't get enough support and it never happened. And so he gave safe passage to the Cathar in this region. And so what we see is that the remnants of the Cathar from France, and so we see sort of almost like a Cathar church emerging, where we have these people who are survivors of the genocide coming together and creating their own way of worshipping and acknowledging what it was that they sort of became committed to as a way of living life with purification, which was highly inspired by Eastern Orthodoxy. Now, during the late 1300s, and this is when the Cathar are just about wiped out, playing cards are introduced into Milan and northern Italy from the Arab states. And their rise in popularity as a game is meteoric, and it replaces dice games. So what people were playing were dice games, and you'd go to the equivalent to a bar, and the men would be sitting around playing a game with dice. And these cards turned up, and all of a sudden these cards took off, and the church had no resistance to it. There was very little resistance to the cards being used. And so they became very, very popular very quickly. And I don't know if anybody's been to Italy in recent years, but if you go to Italy now, and I lived in Italy for a year when I was researching all of this work, you go to a bar in the evening and the men after work are all sitting around playing cards. It's like it's in their DNA that they've got to play cards. And it's still there to this day. They inspire the creation of miniature portable art. And so what happens is people see this and they go, oh, we could make portable art with this. And so this becomes something that starts to happen during this time. With the genocide of the Cathar, their theology is transposed from manuscripts to these cards, which essentially are portable stained glass windows. Inspired by the teachings of Francesco Petrarch, an early humanist, 22 new cards were added to the playing cards, which these new ones were known as the trump suit. So these 22 cards were trump cards that were added to ordinary playing cards. And a new game emerged called Il Triomphe. Now, Petrarch wrote a book about the concept of triumphs or things that triumphed over other things. And the name of his book, which predated these cards, was Il Triomphe. So it's really interesting that, based on the thesis that I'm going to be putting forward to you, is that these deep mysteries or teachings of the Cathar were essentially housed or hidden in these cards under the framework of Petrarch's teaching of triumphs, which had become acceptable and popular and were merged into a game that reflected his teachings, but hidden within them was some of the most amazing, deep, and profound teachings of Eastern Orthodoxy. Teachings associated with purification, illumination, and oneness. This is a short video. This card you can see is one of the remaining parts of the Marseille tarot deck, or Marseille cards. Not Marseille, sorry, the trump cards, the triumph cards that came out of Milan. And this was actually created for the Sforza Visconti family.
Questa collezione esprime il mondo dei tarocchi, che è così presente nella storia della Maison Dior. I tarocchi viscontei sono quelli più antichi. La bellezza principalmente di questi tarocchi è proprio la valenza anche artistica di queste carte.
The Visconti were a noble family who ruled Milan for nearly 200 years, from 1277 to 1447. Francesco Sforza became the first Sforza Duke of Milan, but it was through his wife, Maria Bianca Visconti. Why would this family want to commission a deck? It was for luxury's sake. And like any form of art, it was both beautiful but also a status symbol. This all added up to the prestige of this family. One of the misconceptions about the deck is that they were invented to be used for fortune telling right away. The connection of the tarot to fortune telling only comes about in the late 18th century, and it's due to misinformation published by an author named Antonio de Gabelin. He traced the imagery on the tarot deck back to, of all places, ancient Egypt, specifically to the Book of Thoth. Women play an equal role in the appearance of figures on the cards. We have figures like the Empress, so she's very important, obviously. But we have the interesting character called the Popus, the female Pope. So that was a little bit of an in-joke, but women play a 50-50 role within the card deck. One thing that is very revealing are the costumes, the clothing that they wear. The men and women are dressed very much of their era. And in fact, one of the reasons we can date the deck to the middle of the 15th century is using costume as a means for dating. Here, with the Fool, we can see a good example of skimpy medieval underwear. With the Hangman, we have a great depiction of a medieval t-shirt. The Popus, of course, is very interesting because if we don't trust the legends, there were no female popes in the Middle Ages. This is the earliest depiction of the female pope in tarot history. In the Wheel of Fortune, you can see at the center, blind Fortuna turning the wheel. On the left, the person is rising to power. The ruler is at the top. The one literally falling from power is on the right, and the poor old man at the bottom is about to die.
La mia carta preferita è la morte, perché significa rinascita. Sono molto affezionata a questa carta perché ci ricorda sempre che dietro una fine c'è sempre un nuovo inizio, che dietro ogni fine ci può essere qualcosa di migliore.
Okay, so we've got this amazing situation where these cards have emerged. They're a card game, but they're also pieces of art. And I'm proposing the whole notion that not only were they a game and pieces of art, but I'm going to suggest to you that in fact they house some of the deepest mysteries. Now, what that means, and one of the things that was pointed out in that little video, is that fortune telling, the whole idea of divination, divining, by using cards didn't happen until the 1700s, late 1700s. So we're going from the middle of the 1400s all the way through to the middle of the 1700s. For 300 years, there was no divination being done with these cards. There was other stuff that was happening. And so what I want to do is sort of talk to you about what that other stuff was, and in fact, how significant that is in helping us to understand and what was housed within these cards was what was required to have love, peace, and joy as a way of constant being. I know it sounds funny and bizarre, but here I am marrying this the mysteries of Eastern Orthodoxy and Christianity with tarot cards. And for a lot of people, that's a hard pill to swallow, because for many, many years, we've been taught that the tarot is the book of the devil. But long before they were called tarot cards, they were called the trumps, and they had nothing to do with divination. So if any of you are sort of holding a bit of a, I'm not sure about this, hold that as a context for how you hear what I say moving forward, and hopefully it gives you just a little bit more appreciation. So here are 4 different versions of the same card. This is called the Magician. The one on the left is from 1450 when it was first produced. The one beside that is by Jean Noble, which is 1650. Jean Dadal is in 1700, and Fornia, which is a card producing company in northern Spain, that's their version of it in 1980. So it just gives you, you can see that there's some consistencies in their themes, particularly once we get, once the cards come into southern France, or into France, not just southern France, they become known as the Marseille Tarot. Up until then, they're known as the Trumps or the Triumphi. And so what happened is, when the Italian wars were happening and the French invaded northern Italy, they actually ransacked the library at Puglia, which is the centre of education for the Milan region. And this is where there would have been packs of these cards and libraries, and they actually took all of it and robbed the library of its full library of books and anything that was in there. And these tarot cards would have made their way into France, and then they started to become more exposed in the French region as a result of that. And we start to see them become a standard style, what we'd call a canon. So what we see with the cards in the Marseille Tarot is that the images, you'll notice, for example, that what's on the tables have the similar sort of things, but they're just a little bit different. You know, there's cups and there's a sword, there's a bag, there's a wand, there's a coin, but one's got 2 dice on it, the other one's got 3 dice. They've all got 3 little figures joined together in one place. We see this. The tables have all got 3 legs. You'll notice that the plant between their legs down the bottom is different. There's all these sorts of things. And so, but the theme is the same. So this is the modern version, the 1980 version. I'll be using these in some of the images, and I'll be using some of the Dodal in some of the images. These are the 22 major arcana. These were the ones that were added to the playing cards. So this is what the playing cards look like. One of the things that I can tell you, that in modern terms today, most people do not use the Marseille Tarot for doing fortune telling or divination, because you can see how interesting the images are. They have no appeal to modern tarot cards. Modern tarot cards came about during the 1800s, inspired out of the late 1700s, but they emerged in the 1800s. And this is a whole different approach. And all of these cards had pictures on them. And so they were much more rich in being used for divination and fortune telling. And so you don't see very many people doing that sort of thing and using these cards because of the nature of what you see here. It was used for card games. Finding the map. Now, I lived in Italy for a year and I became aware that there was a map, and I decided that I wanted to get clarity about this. And so I spent a year in Italy while I researched and wrote about this, and I want to share with you what I came up with. What I saw, and I was focusing just on these cards, okay? And the thing that stood out for me right from the go-get was that these two people had the same shaped hat. It was similar. And I'm thinking there's some significance here. And there's some significance in that it was card number 1 and card number 11. So we had card number 1 with 10 cards, 9 cards that followed, and card number 11 that had 9 cards that followed, and then card number 21. And as I played around with this and as I received, and I'm going to say inspiration around this, all of a sudden I had an aha about the shape of the hats. And I took the general shape of those hats and basically saw this as what they essentially represented in their shape, looking down from the top. And it was from here that I was then inspired and where I found the map. So here we have the last card, card number 21, and we see the two circles of the hats overlapping with this Vesicus Pisces, this sacred yoni, this almond shape, it's called a mandala, in the middle there, created by the two overlapping circles. And I decided that cards number 1 and 2 were going to be situated in these positions. Now, part of the reason being, if you have a look at the central figure, she's looking down towards the bull, giving us a hint that this may be the first place to go to, and the bull's looking to the same place. And so I decided, in my wisdom, in my inspiration, to put card number 1 there. And I then made the decision that cards number 1 through 10 made up the left hand, what we call lemniscate or loop. And with card number 11 there, the next 9 cards then made up the right hand loop. And what we ended up with was a map, a layout of the cards that now gave them a meaning and significance that was completely different to the whole idea of the cards being left to right, numbers 1 through to 21. And so the way in which the cards, so if you have a look at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, they're all going to the left. If we'd have put them in normal sequence, they would have gone from 1 to 5 going to the right. And so now we see a sort of a change in the way in which they're relating. The fact that there's a loop brings another whole dimension to it. And the fact that we've got this lemniscate brings another added dimension to it all. And of course, we have the Fool, Lammat. He's you and I. He represents us as human beings on the journey. He's the journeyman, he, she, and he doesn't have a number. The rest have a number because they're signifying a sequence. He doesn't have a number because he's on the journey and he's actually moving around that lemniscate. He's actually going on that journey. So let's have a look at what the map tells us. Now, one of the first things I want to point out, I haven't talked about this much previously, but if you have a look at the left, nearly all of the figures have hats on, and they've got clothing, which represent their hats are symbolic of the head. They're basically things associated with the mind and the state of mind. And clothing is about personality. So what we get is the different styles of clothing tell us a lot about the person in terms of who they are. They give us some understanding. Now, if you have a look at the right-hand side, other than card number 11, essentially, and card number 12, because that's the fool, he's still got his clothing, but essentially the rest of the figures don't have clothing. And certainly they don't have hats. The only person that has a hat is the devil in card 15. Card number 11, she has a hat, but she's a billboard, and I'll talk about her a bit later on. She's an advertisement for the journey. And so what this is saying is that we go from a place of being fully invested in the mind to a place of being divested of the mind and divested of personality. In other words, we're not caught up with our persona. That's just the very first thing that we learn by looking at these images. Now, because and what I'm giving you in this 3 hours is a précis, is a simplified version of what I teach over the 16 session program. And so you're going to have to just sort of go with where I'm going with it. I give more explanation to this in the full program, but for the sake of being able to get through what I want to tonight, you just have to hang in there with what I'm about to share. So here we have the center card, and I'm just looking at the figures on the left-hand side. The center card, Joseph Campbell talks about undifferentiated consciousness. It's his words to describe God, if I can. Now, that figure isn't God. It's the space behind the figure. It's what's on the other side of that mandala, that sacred yoni. That is where God exists. That is the I am. That is infinite consciousness. Okay, we'll talk about who the figure is later on. And this is a window. This sacred yoni is basically a window where God explores the notion or dreams the infinite possibility. And infinite possibility is the whole notion that there's something that God isn't. Of course, none of this is real because it's a dream. But it's a place of differentiated consciousness. So now there is something that God isn't in this dream state. And it's represented by the 4 figures: the bull, the lion, the eagle, and the angel. And so the bull represents physical, the angel represents mental, the lion represents spiritual, and the eagle represents emotional. And so all of a sudden, what we have now, the thing that's really interesting with this is that the Greek Orthodox religion taught that God had 2 qualities. One was essence, and the other one was knowing. Sorry, one was essence and the other one was energy. Sorry, my apologies. And energy was represented by spirit and mind, and essence was symbolized by the physical and by the emotional. And so they became labeled spirit and soul. So the angel and the lion became the symbols for spirit, and the bull and the eagle became symbols for soul. And what happens is we come into a state of soul spirit consciousness, and this is the spirit world. So this is a world between heaven and earth, so as to speak. And there's 2 characters in this place: the magician and we have the popess. And the magician is there saying, you're about to be incarnated as a human being, and you're going to get to experience wands, which represent power, coins, which is about status and wealth. You're going to have swords, which is about success and achievement, and you're going to have cups, which is about love and approval. And these are the things that you're going to be confronting. Now, there's other things on his table which we'll talk about as we go along, but we'll just stick with that for the moment. Then we have the Popess, and she's got the Book of Life. Now, these people were reincarnationists. They believe that we reincarnated. And I can tell you that reincarnation was taught in Christianity up until the 3rd century. So Origen, in Alexander, Clement, the Bishop of Alexander, they were all teaching reincarnation, and they were really important Catholic teachers, or Christian teachers at that point, because the Catholic Church hadn't been established until the Nicene Creed in terms of becoming an established church, in my understanding. Here's the Popess. She's got the Book of Life, and she's looking through the veil. Behind her head is a veil, and it's the veil between the spirit world and the veil between earth. And the lady beside her, who is the Empress, is the mother. Now, we get to talk to the Popess in the spirit world, and she says, well, in your previous incarnations, you've learned this, 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 and this, and this time around, what would you like to learn? And we get to choose. We get to choose which families we want to be with, what we want to learn, who we want to interact with, and we're born. We pass through the veil and we come into human consciousness, the world of illusion. Why do we call it that? Because the billboard for this side was the magician. And what's a magician? He's an illusionist. And what he's saying is, you're coming into a world that isn't real. I want you to entertain this for a moment. How can that be possible? Well, this is how it's possible. When you go to sleep at night and you go into a state of dreaming, and in your state of dreaming, there you are, and you have a whole world that you're experiencing in your place of dreaming. You might be having an affair. You could be running away from somebody, dealing with people that you know in completely different ways. You have this whole experience where you are experiencing everything that you can within that, your mind, your feelings, your desires. It's all being experienced until you wake up. And when you wake up, none of it's there anymore, other than you have the threads of memory that it was there. But the fact was, none of it was real. While you were in it, was it real? You better believe it. Once you finished it, does any of it actually matter? Well, it could be that it was giving you some suggestions about where to go, giving you some advice about life decisions. But ultimately, if you had an affair in your dream, do you have to suffer the consequences of that in your waking state? Now, this is a big one to take on board, because what this would suggest is that there's no punishment associated with what we experience in this reality. There's understanding, and the understanding will be that we haven't loved enough in our actions, that in the things that we did in our dream state wasn't having loved enough, which is the whole notion of differentiated consciousness. In that, we have a much deeper appreciation of love. And we say, I want to come back and give that another go and see if I can do it better this time. All of this is about God exploring infinite possibility of what isn't love in order to better understand and appreciate love. In the absence of that which we are not, it's hard to understand that which we are. So if we didn't have cold, you wouldn't know hot. You know, if you don't have dry, you don't understand wet, or et cetera, et cetera. And so it's like this is where the expansion of undifferentiated consciousness, if we can even contemplate it as a possibility, can happen is in this dream state. And that's what human consciousness is. Then we go to the other side. Okay, so we've got undifferentiated consciousness and we've got differentiated consciousness. Now, we've got this figure here, I call her Hecate, the cards call the Force, and she's a billboard, just like the magician. And she's saying what you're going to need and what this experience is going to be about when you come into this side of it. Now, there's a lot of detail here. We're going to skim through it, but we're going to look at it in detail in the second session after we have our break in half an hour. So this is the Hanged Man. This is still us in our state of human consciousness. Now things start to change because we're in the dark night of the soul. This is called soul consciousness. We're learning who we are in our soul being. This one represents the conception of Christ consciousness. And so this is the idea. Now, when I use the word Christ consciousness, I'm talking about infinite consciousness as it's expressed in this world that we experience as human beings, and that we are all capable of being fully aligned with Christ consciousness. In fact, I would suggest to you that that's what all of this was about. And what is Christ consciousness? Love, peace, joy, and beauty as a way of life, as a way of being. The next three cards are what we call the gestation of Christ consciousness. This is the pregnancy. This card up here is the birth of Christ consciousness. And then we have Christ consciousness as a way of being. And so all of that top section is known as the treasury of light, and it's Christ consciousness that's capable of theosis, of having oneness with God. So all of this was packed into these cards. All of a sudden, none of this has got to do with divination. This is deep mysteries. This is the deep sacred teachings that these people called Cathar subscribed to as a way of living their lives. Okay, so Eastern Orthodoxy, we talked about this before. I'm just going to retouch on this, but I want to add a little bit in there. So the kingdom of heaven, which is found behind that sacred yoni, that almond shape, that is where the kingdom of heaven is. It's behind there. That's the place where there's oneness with God. In other words, all there is infinite being. That's all there is God. Now, how to have theosis. This is what the Cathar did with these teachings. So step 1, purification, was cards 12 to 15. So these cards depict the journey of purification. Step 2, illumination, theoria, cards 16 to 19. And then finally, step 3, oneness, theosis, which were cards 20 and 21. So here we have this really beautiful way in which they were able to use portable stained glass windows to describe this 3-step process at a time when they were being exposed to genocide. And of course, what ended up happening was that when these ended up in France, what we see is this whole sort of breakdown. We see the religious wars. We see the Huguenots. We see Calvin doing his thing. All of a sudden, we see all of this stuff happening in France where there's a liberation. And of course, what happens is these cards become canonized in France, and they become, once again, really important portable stained glass windows. Now, how many people knew what they were? Obviously, some did because they were able to capture the true essence. But once again, it was primarily a card game. So here I am now introducing the Dodal cards. And so we see that here's the journey. The bottom 5 cards there represents purification. The top 5 cards represent, well, the illumination, of which the 2 end ones are the qualifying cards for being able to have oneness or enter back through the sacred yoni back into the presence of God. Okay, so before we take our break, we're just going to just introduce the Beatitudes. So some of you won't know them. Most of you will go, oh yeah, I've heard those before, but we're going to look at these because these are absolutely fundamental to unlocking the deep mysteries that are held within these images. And as Durant said in his book, what we know, and here's what we do know, is that the Cathar basically only subscribed to the Sermon on the Mount in the first 16 chapters of John. They felt that the rest of the Bible had been severely distorted by the church, and they felt that the Sermon on the Mount and the first 16 chapters of John were the most real out of all of the scriptures, and that's what they subscribed to. Remember, I talked about the fact that Buddha had his Eightfold Path of Enlightenment, or Jesus had his Beatitudes. And this was how we could find the kingdom of heaven. So let's have a look at them. So the first Beatitude relates to the hanged man. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. So you would think hanging upside down with your hands tied behind your back could represent being poor in spirit. Spirit is about energy, motivation, and this is about having lost all motivation. Number 2, blessed are those that mourn, for they will be comforted. So we actually see that there's a dying process. This card, you'll notice, it doesn't have a name at the bottom. All the others have a name. A lot of people call this the death card, but it isn't. It's card 13, the card with no name. And that's because this isn't death as we think of death, and that will become evident a little bit later on. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. And so this card is representing, it's called temperance. And temperance is about restraint, but it's also about teachability. And we'll be talking about that as we go through. Then the fourth beatitude are blessed to those who hunger and thirst after righteousness. So here's the word righteousness. So blessed are those who hunger and thirst after purity of heart. So for they shall be filled. And so here we see the devil. And what does the devil do? He tempts us. So blessed are those who have hunger and thirst for purity of heart. So that means you've got to overcome the temptation of the devil. For they shall be filled. You've got to empty out. So we can see this emptying out of that tower, which represents all of the things of the illusionary world. And all the bubbles there represents being filled. We'll talk about what that represents when we get into that a little bit later on. But I just love the way that they had this beautiful representation between the imagery and the Beatitudes. Blessed are the merciful, for they will obtain mercy. So here we see this naked woman pouring water onto the earth and into water. And these are corporal, which is earthly or material mercy, and spiritual mercy, poured in water, or emotional. And we'll talk about them later, but just in the short term, they represent social justice and forgiveness. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. It's like this is the pure in heart is when we've given birth to Christ consciousness. What's that got to do with birth? I mean, we're looking at a crustacean in a pond of water with a couple of dogs and buildings in the background. Well, in the medieval period, crustaceans were called cancer, whether they were lobsters or crabs. And in the astrology version, and everyone was into astrology, by the way, back then, there was a cluster of stars called Priapus, And that cluster of stars, the word Priapus literally meant manger or crib. And it was surrounded by Borealis, Australis Borealis, and another one that I can't remember off the top of my head, which means donkeys. And so literally that crab is symbolic of the birth of Jesus, but symbolic of the birth of Christ consciousness. Beautiful symbology, if you understand what's there. Then you've got blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called the children of God. So here we see two children, and they're in a place of embrace. They've become peacemakers, and we'll talk about that. Now, what I haven't included is the eighth beatitude, and there was an eighth beatitude, and I just need you to go with me on the fact that it has a whole different feel and meaning as it relates to the rest of the cards. Even Augustine went to the trouble to say that he didn't believe it was part of the original teachings. It was added in later on, and I subscribe to that. All right. So why we suffer? The crossroad. So where we start with after we've sort of evolved from childhood, there's our mother, we're the fool. And basically our journey is we have this innate desire for happiness. And it becomes the search for happiness. Now, here's what happens is in our formative years, we're basically taught what is needed to, what we need to have in order to be happy. We're modeled it by our family, by our culture, by our society. We're modeled what you need to think, what you need to feel, what you need to wear, what you need to desire. All of these things become the programming that we receive about how we can be happy. And there's four domains that they really show up in. And the first is about control or obedience or rebellion, or, so what we end up with is the more I do what people want me to do, the happier they'll be and the happier I'll be. And so we go through this whole thing of trying to be good, do the right thing. And of course, we see lots of things happen in the world where we become both culturally, globally, societally pressured into turning up and being a certain way in order to make sure we don't upset the apple cart, that we don't cause pain for ourselves. And we see lots of situations around that. Status. If you drive the right car, if you live in the right suburb, if you have the right job, etc., etc., etc. If you have the right hairdo or whatever it is. But what we have are all these things that if I have status, then I'll be happy. If I have wealth, then I'll be happy. And so, and of course, inversely, if I don't have wealth, then I'm not going to be happy. And if I'm a victim and I maintain victimhood, I'm not going to be happy. So in other words, the whole happiness thing is all being dictated to by these external measures. Now, interesting enough, if you have a look at the emperor, he's got a 4 in front of his eyes. And that 4 basically says there's 4 key things that you're going to have your eyes on. And he's dictating to you, the fool, what those things are. And he's saying I'm number 1, which is about control. Number 2 is status. Number 3 is love. or being loved. So if you love a certain person, love in a certain way, then you'll be happy. And what we see here is, for example, so and I'll come back for a minute. If you have a look at the emperor, he's got a staff with an orb on the end. They were normally separate things, and so does the empress. And basically, the emperor and the empress, who are our parents, and they're joined. And so the orb and the scepter are joined, the orb representing the feminine, the scepter the masculine, and they're joined. So those two are one, and they function as number one of the four elements. Then we've got the Pope. How interesting to have a Pope who represents spiritual, but he represented status as well, particularly at this particular point during the 1300s, because the Pope went and where his crown actually took on a whole different form, from being just one dome with one layer of a crown to actually having three levels. And he was saying, I'm the high priest, I'm the emperor of emperors, and I'm the king of the Holy Land of Rome. No, not Rome, but where the church is established in Rome. And so he's about status now. And of course, what we have is the opposite, and we know it's about status, is two monks in front of him, and they represent the Franciscans. They've got tonsures, and they were the poor brethren. They were the monks that were poverty oriented. And he's got his finger in the shape of a two. There's two of them, and there's two poles behind him. So these are two out of number four. And then we've got three people there. We've got the central figure, and then we have three loves. And this is based on a Greek tradition. So the loves were defined as storge, philia, and eros. So storge was family, philia was friends, and eros was lovers. And these are the places where we would look for our sense of having acceptance and approval and validation. And so our sense of love is sourced by external acceptance and approval in this part of our journey. And then the fourth one is the chariot. And once again, here we see four. You can see there's four corner poles. The shape of the chariot is square or rectangle, and there's four mechanisms of movement, two wheels and two horses. And so the four is about success and achievement in the world. And so this is the victor's chariot. And he's representing the whole idea that it's a conquest in the world. You've got to go out and succeed in the world to prove your worth and your value. Here's what's interesting is that he has a baldachin, a canopy over the top of him. And that canopy represents, once again, another form of veil. It's a veiling or separation. And this is basically suggesting at this point in our journey, we are now fully removed. We are the most distant from infinite consciousness that we can possibly be from our perspective in terms of our understanding, because we're so fully involved in the need for control and status and love and success. And so these become the things that we fully immerse ourselves in terms of our experience. However, something really interesting happens, and that is the next three cards, which are classic trump cards, turn up. Justice, time, and chance. Justice is predominantly natural justice. So in other words, this is when in our, for example, status, if we were really gung-ho about status, we kept on spending money in order to establish our status, what we might do is put ourselves into financial stress and could experience bankruptcy or something else. It's not like justice is punishing us. It's the natural consequence of those choices. And so that can be applied to any of these things when they're out of, success and achievement. We're so driven to succeed in the world that we burn the candle at both ends. We're working incredibly long hours and trying to achieve our success in the world. And what happens is next thing we have a heart attack, or something happens as a direct result of burnout, for example, as a direct result of having had an imbalance with that. Conditional love, where we've set conditions on love in our relationships. And of course, what happens is those conditions are broken, and we get heartbroken and we're in a place of pain. So what happens is justice has the ability to bring us to this point of suffering. Now, these three are the three baubles that were on the magician's table. So, as much as the magician had wands, which was associated with the emperor, and coins associated with status, and cups associated with hearts, and swords associated with success, as much as they're on his table, he also had these three other figures, and that was justice, time, and chance. And he's saying that in this world, in this illusionary world, you're going to experience natural justice. You eat too much sugar, and there's a very good chance in refined carbohydrates that you're going to get diabetes. Nobody's sitting there punishing you. That's natural justice. Okay. The next one is time, old man time. And so here we have the whole image that when we get older, all of a sudden the things that we relied on to make us happy are no longer available, and because we can't access them, we're not happy. This was beautifully represented in midlife crisis. People get to 55 and they had the house and the mortgage was paid off, and they had the right job and the right relationship, the kids growing up and everything, but they're not happy. They're still not happy. They're still wanting more in order to be happy. And that's what was called the midlife crisis. Of course, it's no longer 55. It seems to be happening much earlier. But it's this whole idea that as we get older, I mean, how many of you are finding that you just can't do the things that you used to do once upon a time? And it gets frustrating, particularly when we start to have our body breakdown, when joints start to be compromised. The number of people that I have in my social network who have had joint surgery over the last couple of years is ridiculous, and in terms of the things that they've had to go through. But there's so many other diseases that we're confronting associated with old age that literally make it difficult for us to really enjoy life like we used to. It just doesn't have that same capacity to bring us the joy that it did when we were younger. And then we have the Wheel of Fortune. And of course, the Wheel of Fortune is about good fortune, bad fortune, good luck, bad luck. And it's this whole idea that the wheel turns, and so when the wheel turns, we're either have things work in our favor, but equally they can go against us. And so we end up having good luck, bad luck. And of course, when things are taken away from us through things like natural causes, in terms of bushfires or floods, for example, these are the sorts of things that can bring devastation to people's lives. Car accidents. We just had a situation again where I saw some reference to a man and his son were walking along to get an ice cream and got hit by a car and killed. I mean, that's a fairly rough version of the Wheel of Fortune, but it's this whole idea that there's no guarantee, and the wheel can turn. And once again, in that place, it brings us huge suffering. All of these things result in basically showing us that control, status, love, and success are not sustainable. and that in fact, because of the nature of them, can only end up in suffering. And so, as much as we go on this journey in order to find happiness, what we end up is this experience of suffering. So when we get to the wheel, we come to a crossroads. So you can see it there. You can see where the angel is in the top left-hand corner of the world card, and the card to the top left of that is the Wheel of Fortune. So this is how this looks. So we're at a crossroad when we get there, as you can see. Now, the reason that I put Hermes, the magician, as he's known, at the crossroad is because that was part of the role of Hermes. Herms were, in fact, carved stone penises that used to be put in the middle of an intersection with the name of the next destination in the 4 different directions. And so, and I talk about that in the 16 session program. But Hermes is at the crossroad. But here we have the Wheel of Fortune, and here we have you and I as the fool, born of our mother. So here's our mother. And we go on our journey, and just as time and chance have done their thing, and we've hit a rough road. Okay, we're having a tough time. Now, what happens when we hit a rough road, when we get to this point where things have really been turned upside down for us, and just as time and chance have done their thing? How do we deal with that? How do we stop experiencing our suffering? For most of us, particularly if it's creating dis-ease within our body, we will look for pleasure, sex, drugs, and rock and roll. In other words, we will find things to do to distract us from our suffering. Consumerism, drugs and alcohol, sex, exercise. There could be a whole lot of what seem to be healthy things that we're doing that are addictive in nature. But we go to this place where we try to avoid experiencing the sensation. And of course, the way that the majority of the world deals with it today is through antidepressants. It's probably close to, if not the number one medication that's prescribed globally, is antidepressants. Why? Because people have come to this place here and they don't know where else to go. Or there's some choices that they don't want to make. Now, some people have got the get up and go where they go round the roundabout. So here they are at the rough road and they say, do you know what? I can get on top of this, and they reinvent their life. They come back around and they've got the new clothes, the new girlfriend, the new car, etc., etc. But instead of it taking 30 years to get around there, or 40 years, it takes 5 years. And they find themselves back in the same place. I know some people that have actually done it a third time. Okay, but not everybody's got that, and that's why we end up with the antidepressants. Sometimes the antidepressants give us enough of a breather that we have another go, but we still end up back at the same place. The third option is the dead end, which is suicide. And we know for a fact that there are more and more people who are making that choice these days. And the fourth option is the dark night of the soul. It's the journey down that very steep hill where things fall apart very quickly. And it's like we're racing down to this dark space that we don't really know what's there. The interesting thing about the dark night of the soul is that there's not a lot of understanding about it, but more to the point, there are very few people capable of helping guide us through the dark night of the soul. And I'd like to say and suggest that that's what I'm doing by virtue of the work. The dark night of the soul is the journey of purification. And through my deep understanding of what was in the essence of these cards, I understand what's required to make the transition through this journey through the dark night of the soul. This is what's going to be necessary in order to stop the suffering. If you can't encounter the dark night of the soul, you'll keep on suffering. So I'm suggesting that if you can encounter the dark night of the soul, you can move into enlightenment, and the place of enlightenment is a place where you become free of suffering. More about that later. Okay. So I want to now detail the 4 steps to transcendence. And that's about going down this dark night of the soul journey and what's involved in that. And we're going to touch once again on these. Obviously, we spend one session on each of these. There's 2 cards basically in each of these 4 steps. When we're working through the program and we get to this point in the journey, we have one session for each card. In other words, we go into it in a lot of detail in terms of not just knowledge, but being experiential in terms of how you relate to it. Step 1, entering the dark night of the soul. This is the first beatitude, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of God. So here we see the hanged man. He's hanging upside down. He's hanging by one foot. And he's there because of the pruning of justice, time, and chance that you can see on the left-hand side. So you can see the trees that are holding him up have been pruned by justice, time, and chance. And basically, he symbolizes the state of grief. The grief that comes from the loss of what you treasured: status, wealth, power, control, love, acceptance, success, and achievement. So this is a very, very painful place. And the word spirit is about energy. It's about, if you think of team spirit, it's about that ability to move forward, to be progressive. And this is saying, blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are those who can't do that. Blessed are the people who are in this painful place. And he goes on to say, for theirs is the kingdom of God. So this is really significant. This is saying that if you're in a place where your spirit's been broken, then in fact, this is a gift. This is a blessing, because now you can have the kingdom of God. Now, when it comes to this one here, this is the point at which we have to make a confession in this particular place, not to the priest, by the way. This is a confession that we make to ourselves. And what you're doing is confessing to your suffering, to yourself, in a journal. And you can write this down, as you can take these. In a journal, describe the things that are causing your suffering. Remember, you can't change what you can't see. So this is really important, that you're able to look at these 4 areas and become really clear. And so what we do is, when I work with this, I see people who have done lots and lots of spiritual work, but they've still got pain about their relationship. They're still suffering in their relationship. And struggling, or they're somebody that's on their own and is struggling to find somebody to be in relationship with. So their suffering is their loneliness and their isolation. Now, we have it in our heads, but it's important that we can journal it. It's important that we can sit and write down those places where we're experiencing suffering, particularly as it relates to status and wealth, power and control, love and acceptance, success and achievement. Okay? Here's what I would suggest to you, that if you aren't living a life with love, peace, joy, and beauty as the way in which you experience life, then the things that you experience will be fitting into one of those 4 areas. Wealth, power and control could be about dealing with issues associated with the government, or it could be about a paternalistic member of the family, or it could be an employer that you're dealing with, and you know, these places where you're being taken out of your stillness. It takes time to do this. So that's one of the places that I would highly recommend. This is the first thing to do, is to get really clear of your suffering. And that's the other thing, is be honest about how much you're suffering in your experience. In other words, what are you doing to avoid your suffering? Are the things and strategies that you've put in place that become cover-ups for the suffering that you're experiencing? The evidence that you're suffering is that love, peace, joy, and beauty are not paramount realities in your experience. Okay. Blessed are those that mourn, for they will be comforted. This seems like a very unusual card to do with mourning, because what we have is now this isn't you and I who are cut up in pieces on the ground. These are the symbols reflected in the cards of the things to which we were attached that were causing our suffering and our grief. So this is a severing to some extent of our attachment, or the grief that we have, which is the evidence of our attachment to those things. So let's have a look at what this word mourning represents. Mourning, I lived in Italy and I got to see several rituals of mourning. And in one of the houses, or one of the apartments underneath where I lived in a Castello village, they had the deceased family member, the father was in a coffin in the lounge room, and it was sort of at ground, you sort of walk through the castle pathways, and you open the front doors, and he was the lounge, and I'd walk past and he was the dead father in a coffin for 3 or 4 days in the lounge. And there were mourners there. There were people who were mourning. They were expressing the loss of this man to them. Now, in Europe, there are professional mourners. These are women who come along and sit and mourn on behalf of all the families. So what are they doing? They're externalizing their grief. For most of us, grief is internal. We may have moments where there's tears, anger, frustration that can be associated with it, but most of it's internalized. What is happening here is that we are externalizing our pain and we're observing the experience. Now, you'll notice that that's what's really significant about the head in this character, is that yes, you've got the stuff underneath it, but it's like the head really nearly takes over. And it's like this really intense state of observation going on. And all of the cards depict this in the same way. By observing your experience, you can free yourself from the pain of loss. You can find a place of comfort. Well, how's that possible? When you become the observer, you're in a state of awareness. And the state of awareness just can is knowing that there's an experience, okay, as opposed to experiencing the experience. They're two different things. Observing knows there's an experience, whereas the mind experiences the experience, and it's really the mind experiences the experience. The mind suffers. The observer doesn't feel anything. There is no feeling other than comfort. Freedom from the pain. There's stillness in the place of being the observer. Now, I've got a really lovely tool that makes it a possibility, and I call it using full stops as a way to observe the facts of your grief. As I say here, when we use a comma, you stop observing and re-engage the mind with its judgments and drama. So what do I mean by using a full stop? When something happens, when you're having a moment of grief, instead of going through and talking about all of the extensions of the loss and what's going on, just identify what's happening in the moment, and that is this person has passed on, full stop. Don't add anything to it. You just observe the fact. It might be that you then you have a fact associated with your reason for the loss of this person. It might be that you felt very special because they were in your life, and as such are feeling the pain that you are. And so you can state that as a fact. I'm missing this person a lot. I'm grieving them because they were special to me, or I was special to them, depending on what our narrative is. Full stop. See, the comma then evokes the whole notion of then colouring that in with thoughts, feelings, and desires and perceptions. And so all of a sudden, we distort the fact through the filters, our filters. Now, it's not saying that our filters are inappropriate, but that's what's causing the pain. And what we're being taught here is that if we can move into the place of being the observer through mourning, then we're able to find the place of comfort. Now, what we're talking about here is the mourning as it relates to our loss of the things that we experienced as a result of justice, time, and chance. Okay, so this is special relationships, like we just indicated, but it could be a loss of status, or it could be a loss of power, it could be a loss of love, it could be a loss of any of those four things. Now, it's not uncommon for people when they get to that place of being poor in spirit that they actually decide that they're going to have another go at life. They don't want to go down this mourning route. And so what we call that is the dark night of the senses. And I would suggest to you that we only go through one dark night of the soul in our life. We might have many dark night of the senses, but we only have one, what I would call dark night of the soul. And And part of the evidence of that is that we are starting to develop a sense of a lack of need around wealth, power, love, and success as a result of becoming the observer of our grief associated with that loss. A dark night of the senses, we decide to go back and try and do it again. And how many people do you know have come to these dark places and they go back and try to re-engage the world of illusion again, just doing it differently? If I do it differently, then it'll be a different experience, but they end up back in the same place. Once we step into fully engaging this experience of being the mourner, what we do is we're severing our attachment to wealth, power, love, and success. And that's all the things that are seen in the ground. And we're now fully present by living in a state of awareness. So being the observer is entry-level awareness, where we're coming into a place of being aware. Okay. And so the next part in the journey is temperance. And she says, or this card says, blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. In other words, they will become humble. The word earth is humus. The word humble shares humus as its roots. And so this is about a state of humility. And temperance means that we are basically releasing now our engagement in the world of illusion. We're showing some sense of willpower not to go down that route because we're prepared to be in a place of being teachable. And literally, this is the point at which, first of all, temperance is moderation or self-restraint, but the image of poured water symbolizes new knowledge. When the student is ready, the teacher appears. So in other words, when we're still caught up in our grief and our suffering of loss, we can't hear new knowledge. The student has to be teachable in order for the teacher to manifest. So, one of the things that we've got is she's filling a cup. Well, the cup had to be emptied in order for her to fill it. Well, we saw the hanged man turned upside down. He was being emptied out at that point. The cup has been emptied out and now it's being refilled with new knowledge. Inheriting the earth is humility. It's being teachable. Here you want the still small voice to be your teacher. So this is the point at which you get divine guidance. The Holy Spirit of wisdom would be another name for that, where you're actually being, and Steiner described the way of doing that is trusting your inspiration, your imagination and intuition. But in order for that to happen, you've got to be still. In order to be still, you have to be in a place of comfort. You have to be in a place where the mind is no longer in control. And so that's why mourning is so important, to allow us to get to that place of comfort, to enable us to be able to listen for guidance. Now, not everybody does it differently, but my experience in listening to the still small voice was that it was accompanied by peace. So in other words, when I was given inspiration or intuition, or my imagination was filled, if that was accompanied by peace, I knew it was the still small voice, the Holy Spirit of wisdom. If it wasn't accompanied by that, then it was my own mind. And that became a really important distinction, was to become familiar with that stillness and that peace, which is what happens when we inherit the earth. When we're in that place of humility, we're no longer desiring the treasures of the world of mammon. We're teachable. We're here now. And we're waiting for the guidance to happen. So, for example, part of my journey was to, I was inspired to write about this stuff. Never written a book in my life. Struggled to get through English when I was in high school, so the whole idea of writing was bizarre for me. But I was prompted that I needed to go and write this work, and I was prompted to go to Italy. Never been to Italy in my life. But the still small voice was giving me guidance. and it felt still. It didn't feel right. It didn't feel exciting. It was accompanied by a sense of stillness. And when I got off the plane in Italy, the first thing that happened was the sensation like I'd come home. In the first couple of weeks I was in Italy, I'd been told by the people I was renting the house from, who they were Australians, the apartment that I had in this little village, they said, go to Monte Cassino and listen to the Gregorian chanting. And I thought, yeah, that's 5th century living history. That's something I'd love to do. And I had acquired a second-hand scooter, and I rode 70 kilometres on my 250 Honda scooter to go and listening to Gregorian chanting. And I'm sitting in the cathedral waiting for the service to start. And next thing I had this voice say, welcome back. You've come back to finish what you started. Now it's time to finish it. And it was a prompting that said, get in and start doing the writing and you'll be guided. And that's exactly what happened, was that the Holy Spirit of wisdom, the still small voice, literally opened up my mind and my understanding that enabled me to be able to tell you all the things that I'm telling you tonight. Nobody else has discussed the tarot cards in this way ever before. And this all came as a result of guidance, not me researching and writing from other books. This was what was happening at this point. And I can tell you that I was at that place because of a lot of suffering that had gone on in my life in terms of depression and obesity. If you haven't read any of the stuff, divorce. I became a single dad of my 2 youngest children, one of whom was intellectually impaired, and I became her, along with Tegan's help, her primary supporter. And my whole world was collapsed. But that's the point at which I was ready to listen. That was the point at which the student was ready. And the teacher, in the form of Holy Spirit of wisdom, turned up. And that's what happens in this place, is when you are teachable, when you're right, the right person turns up. Or the right piece of music, or the right bit of poetry, or the right bit of art, or the right movie. It could be any teacher. In fact, it's not necessarily a person, but the right thing turns up to give you the guidance, and it's accompanied by peace and stillness. And what happens is And I call this the conception of Christ consciousness. This is where the seeds of Christ consciousness are planted. This is the conceiving. We know that it's a conception because of the red rose on the forehead of temperance. A white rose symbolized the Virgin, okay, the Virgin Mary, and a red rose symbolized the conception of her having been conceived of Jesus. And this is the point at which the seeds of Christ consciousness have been planted within us in this place. And that's what's happening here with this water being poured into this cup, is that the seeds of Christ consciousness are now being planted in our being, in our soul. Which brings us to blessed are those who hunger and thirst after righteousness. In the Old Testament, when Adam and Eve were expelled from the Garden of Eden, the scriptures tell us that God put two gatekeepers at the eastern gate. One was a flaming sword and the other one was a cherubim. For those of you that have been to church, I would suggest that hardly any of you would have ever heard your minister give a sermon about the cherubim and the flaming sword. Yet they were fundamental for getting back into heaven, which is, I think, is quite interesting. In fact, if you have a look at this card, it's not quite clear in this image what that is, but what he's holding in his left hand is a flaming sword. That was the flaming sword. And what he's doing is, this is the devil, this card here. And can I suggest to you that what he's saying is that the mind is the devil. And the mind, which is the mechanism that we use to engage life, has been programmed by our will, which is our spirit, our determination, our desires. And all of our desires that have programmed our mind came from our childhood programming. In other words, how we were programmed has established the activity of the mind, and because it's easier to let neural programs take over, we let the mind then take over, manifesting our reality based on our programming. So what's that got to do with the flaming sword? It's called the Abrahamic test. Abraham was asked to sacrifice Isaac. Why? Because Abraham's narrative was based on abandonment by his father. And he spent his life running a story about a separation in relationship between father and son. And guess what happened? He wasn't able to have children. That was his suffering. That was his pain because of his narrative about abandonment. And so all of a sudden, at the age of 100, he finally has a child, his creation with Sarah, his wife, not her handmaiden, as he had done previously. And God says, if you want to serve me, you can't be attached to Isaac, which is part of your narrative. I want you to take him and I want you to sacrifice him. And what does the sacrifice involve? Cutting the throat and burning what's on the altar. That's the flaming sword. The sword is for cutting and killing, and the flame for burning. He says, I want you to sacrifice Isaac. Now, here's the thing. Isaac's a metaphor for Abraham's narrative of the abandoned child and his fear and his sense of not having connection with his own father, and therefore his lack of connection with children. Do you know what the promise to God was? That he would have more children than there would be grains of sand on the beach or stars in the heavens. Yet Abraham spent 100 years caught up in his narrative of separation and abandonment. So you and I have to go to the place where we actually sacrifice our 7-year-old's narrative. The Jesuits had a saying, Aristotle said it, give me a boy until he is 7 and I will give you the man. We as adults, if we're in a place of suffering, and here's what I can tell you, you will revert, when you revert to your old thinking and habits, it's because of your 7-year-old. Anytime you're out of stillness, it's your 7-year-old. Anytime your mind is being pulled over in all sorts of different directions, it's your 7-year-old. Now, the devil is saying that's what happens. He's the mind. But he's also giving us the clues for how to overcome it. And there's two things, his open hand and the flaming sword. And the open hand says it's being held up in air. And the element of air is associated with the mind. And he's saying, let go of your attachment to the mind. See his hands open? There's no holding on. Let your hand be detached from the air. Don't hang on to anything in the air, which is the mind. Become the witness, the observer. Meditation. Practicing that ability to see the thoughts come and go and not hang on to them. But in addition to that, you also have to go through the process of sacrificing the 7-year-old. Do you want to know how you do that? By observing the narrative. When something's observed, it changes. And so you have to know what your 7-year-old narrative is. And that's part of what we will discuss in the work that we do with you, is help you identify your 7-year-old narrative. But you've got to be able to sacrifice the 7-year-old. So the tool. Now, this is another tool of observation, but this is going to another level here. And this is sort of representing this level of advanced separation here. In our languaging, when we say, I am, we are saying we are aware of something. When we use the words, I am, that's a statement of, I know, when we say I am. In this tool, instead of focusing on the something, which is the experience of the mind, the activity of the mind, focus on the I am, that part of you that is aware of the experience. Now, I'm going to go so far as to say that the I am is our divine self. This is the I am that I am. This is our divine being. And so what we do is we go, I am hurting, and we focus on the hurt. So the open hand way of relating to this is to focus on the I am, not the hurt. Focus on that which is knowing the hurt, not that which is hurting. That's how we overcome the mind. It's simple, but really powerful. Do you know how many times in your mind, one way or another, you say, I am, in the course of a day? That might be an activity for you to do, is just pay attention to how often you're saying, I am, in the course of your day. And take a moment to step back and look at where your focus is. Is it on the I am, or are you focusing on the experience? I can guarantee it's the experience, which is the activity of the mind. The I am is the activity of consciousness. Step 3, entering the treasury of light. The second part of that beatitude, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. So what happens in that place when we give up the mind we actually now hunger and thirst for purity of heart. We've learnt about it. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst after righteousness. So in other words, we've learnt about it. We now desire it. But what happens is the devil gets in the way and keeps on trying to stop us. And what we've got to do is prove that we have a hunger and thirst for this by practicing those intervention methods that we talked about, for they will be filled. Now, here's what's happening at this point in the journey. You'll notice the people falling out of the tower, the crown coming off it, but notice that the flame's going up towards the sun. So the flame, which is our spirit, it's the fire element is spirit, the air element is mind, the earth element is the body, and the water element is emotion. The fire element, which is will and determination, we are choosing to turn it towards light, the highest light. So instead of being in darkness, remember we talked about the Four Noble Truths of Jesus was saying, now we're choosing to be oriented towards light, the light of Christ. And because we've now made that the thing that we hunger and thirst after, we naturally let go of wealth, power, love, and success as reflected in the tower and the people falling out of the tower. So in other words, we just voluntarily, we don't even have to use discipline to do it because we've become so committed to becoming oriented towards Christ consciousness. And now the baubles in the air represent consciousness. And that is the house of God. The house of God is consciousness, not matter, not relationships, not wealth, not success. Its awareness is the house of God. Having practiced being more aware by relinquishing your childhood narrative, that informs the activity of the mind. You are now entering the house of God. So what's the tool that I've got here? At this point in the journey, where you naturally choose to be aligned with, this is the point where with spiritual values. And here's what I say, create a vision board. So in other words, play with the notion for how unconditional love, peace, fulfillment, and beauty would manifest in your life. Start to entertain what it would look like to have those things as a way of life. You know, and I did that, and part of how I live my life now is that I have the most amazing, loving relationships with the people in my life, but I have a partner, and I was describing our relationship, what I was telling you before, in terms of how we relate to each other. We don't live together. My partner still lives on the Sunshine Coast, and I live in the Bunya Mountains. We're 3 hours from each other, but totally committed and devoted to each other. But we're also totally committed and devoted to our work. And so I also have amazing fulfillment from the work that I do. This is something that is just absolutely, I have joy in every moment, in every day. I'm having joy as my reality. I live in a place of peace. I mean, I have peace within myself, but I also choose to live. I live in a rainforest off-grid, fully surrounded by trees and vegetation and nature. And so I have beauty around me as well. What would your world look like if you decided that you were about having love, peace, joy, and beauty as your reality? Create a vision board of that and sit in the stillness and be guided with that too, by the way. Let the Holy Spirit of wisdom help inspire that for you. This is where you get to use your imagination. So now we move into illumination fully, and this is the illumination of the stars. Blessed are the merciful, for they will obtain mercy. So now what we get is that this is associated with the idea of social justice. That's what mercy is. And so what we see here, it's having an awareness of mercy is now paramount. And this includes corporal works of mercy, helping the needy, and spiritual forgiveness, works of mercy. And you can see her pouring water into water, which is forgiveness, and water onto the land, which is social justice, helping the needy. And of course, Jesus, in his teachings, both in the sermon and later in Matthew, he talks about these, in terms of helping the needy. He says, feed the hungry, visit the sick, clothe the naked, go to those in jail. He talks about what that looks like. He said, you're going to have a life that's oriented towards seeing and responding to the needs of people. And then the other one is forgiveness. And that's about turning the other cheek, blessing those that curse you, do good to those that hate you. All of those things that he talked about, he's saying, if you're moving into this level of enlightenment, then you have to have that as the two core foundations to how you approach life. And the bright and morning star, in this particular case, and this was how the Cathar related to Jesus, they didn't see Jesus as a saviour, they saw him as an exemplar. And the bright and morning star was Jesus, who was demonstrating to people how to have corporal and spiritual works of mercy as fundamental to how you live your life. And the 7 stars relates to the corporal and spiritual works of mercy. So once again, a really beautiful image. And now she's pregnant. At this point here, she's pregnant with Christ. So we've been going through the gestation period, and she's now about to give birth to Christ consciousness. So before we can fully adopt Christ consciousness, we have to know how to incorporate corporal and spiritual works of mercy as our fundamental way of turning up in the world. So the tool here, commit daily to serving those in need, especially when inspired. Now, to gain a deeper appreciation of forgiveness, I'm going to suggest to you that you watch a 8-part blog series that I did, and you can get that on that reference there at the bottom. I'll leave that there for a second so you can write that down. That will actually take you to the first of the blog series on forgiveness, and I'm looking at forgiveness in all of its dimensions. It's a very powerful education about how to adopt forgiveness into your life. Take a photo of it with your phone if you've got your phone, or look at it when you get the video of all this, and you can write it down later on as well. So this is the glory of the stars. We haven't got to the glory of the moon or the sun yet. This is entry level. That you have to be doing this first before you can go anywhere else. And so if you're serious about this journey, it's like, well, what will this look like? You need to understand, first of all, what forgiveness looks like and how to do it, and what social justice looks like and how you can do it. Once again, in terms of social justice, be inspired about how to do that. Okay. Step 4. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. And this is the birth of Christ at this particular point. And I talked to you about how that crayfish and the constellation of Cancer represented that. And purity of heart is about charity. In this card, the moon represents Cancer as well as water does, as well as the crayfish. And this was about the divine state of motherhood. And Buddha talks about it being the highest state of love. All mankind could follow the example of the giving nature of mothers as an example of charity, or what we call the charices. And charity is pure love. Now, what does that mean in terms of what we have to do? Remember that it's about giving birth to the child and nurturing the child as it relates to its core essential meaning. But in what it represents, it's a metaphor for us devoting our lives to helping other people give birth to the Christ within themselves. In other words, when you get to this point here, what you're going to do is become a savior for other people. You're going to devote your life to doing work that is about helping other people find Christ consciousness in their own right. And your life will be committed to that. Here's the big thing about that. You could be a street sweeper and still do that. I had a poem in my Bible as a teenager that said, I would rather see a sermon than hear one any day. I would rather one would walk with me and clearly show the way. You become the greatest teacher by your living all of these things that we've been talking about as a way of life. Doesn't matter what you're doing, you're bringing, and people will want to know. People will want to understand what you have and why you are the way you are. But this isn't an intellectual engagement. This is about social justice. This is about forgiveness. This is about divine love for humanity. This is about the fact that you know the essence of these people that you connect with, and that your only role and purpose is to turn up in this incredibly loving way to these people. This is the birth of Christ consciousness within you. At this point in the journey, you devote your life to help others be more in touch with their soul being. The tool. What you value has shifted from the tower, which was what we saw in the House of God card, to the gifts of the Holy Spirit. And now you are given the gifts of the Holy Spirit in this place, which is knowledge, understanding, wisdom, courage, piety, divine guidance, and awe of the infinite being. Part of this tool is reflect on the ways that you can connect with these gifts. So if you've become fully aligned with Christ consciousness, then these are the gifts that you're being blessed with. How can you connect with these? What would they look like in your experience? Which brings us to the sun card. And once again, I'm just going to say I'm giving you the minimum. So there's still a dog and buildings and that I haven't talked about. That, I can't give it all. I can't do it all in 3 hours. But I'm giving you the taste of them, and the core and the tools are really important. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called the children of God. And so here we have infused, and I'll read this, infused with the gifts of the Spirit, the fruits of the Spirit reveal your true nature. You now see the world through a filter that has you be a peacemaker. So in fact, how we become a peacemaker is through these gifts of the Spirit. So the Spirit is fully imbued in our life now. And this is the tool. And I want to, the Spirit, fruits of the Spirit are love, joy, peace, long-suffering, faith, gentleness, goodness, meekness, and temperance. Take time each day to reflect on how these fruits are manifested in your life and consider if you are as much the recipient as the giver. So the peacemaker, can you imagine if you're bringing, when you turn up in the world with love, joy, peace, long-suffering, faith, gentleness, goodness, meekness, and temperance, that's who you are and you turn up in the world. Do you think you're not going to be a peacemaker? When those things become the essence of your being and you fully identify with that as who you are, and having the gifts of the Spirit, knowledge, understanding, wisdom, courage, piety, divine guidance, and awe of infinite being, you are just shining. There is no darkness in you anymore when your life is filled with those things. Is it possible? You better believe it. Okay. Transcendence. So this is Theoria. It starts with the judgment. Okay, so we have the judgment card. And this is like, do you match what's needed in order to be able to be transcendent? And here's Michael the Archangel with the trumpet, and he has what's a flag on it. And flags were called the standard. So this was the standard that you had to meet. So we have these two figures, this man and woman, who had done everything they can to raise their consciousness, which is demonstrated by this figure in the center. That's in the process of being resurrected. But the flag is really important, and it's about the four. It's got four corners. It's got the cross. And that cross is very indicative of the Greek Orthodox cross and its style. If you remember, we started with the four right at the very beginning, which was the bull, the lion, the eagle, and the angel, as God explored the idea of what God wasn't through physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual. Then we see the four associated with the magician, the wands, the pentacles, the swords, and the cups. Then we see the four associated, see the shape of the emperor's legs in the shape of a four, plus he had a four. He's got him and the empress, he's got the pope, the lovers, and the chariot are all about the evolving and the expanding of these four into different dimensions of experience and reality. And then we have the hanged man. He's upside down, his legs in the shape of a four. And he's going through these experiences of the hanged man, which is the element of air. He's hanging in air. We've got the death card, which is the things are in the earth. We've got temperance is pouring water. We've got the devil card who's got the flaming sword. So the four elements are being experienced again. So what we're going through is a process of recalibrating, refining, being able to bring a maturing to those four elements. Now, just by virtue of, and I just throw this in, the red and the gold, the red related to energy and the gold related to essence. Remember, I said to you right at the beginning, these were the two qualities of the divine, was essence and energy. Being is essence and knowing is energy. The last test before Adam and Eve could go back into the Garden of Eden was the test of the cherubim. Ezekiel said the cherubim was an angel that had 4 faces. How interesting. They were the face of a bull, a lion, an eagle, and an angel, which is what we saw up in the top left-hand corner there, the bull, the lion, the eagle, and the angel. So the tower was about the point at which we had a choice in terms of where we focused our energy, our desire. So that was energy as it related to the choice that we made to be directed towards Christ consciousness. Then we have the gold, which is about mercy. And this is the essence of our character, the nature of who we are, is compassionate and loving and caring. We have gold as in charity, as it relates to not just helping people as human beings, but helping people as soul beings, and bringing people to that point of fully being aligned with their higher Christ self and devoting our lives to serving in that way. But it's the being of bringing that love, once again, that next dimension of love in that way. And then finally, the final red element is bringing peace to the mind. So we had will up in the top left-hand corner. Down here, we've got the state of the mind being in a place of total peace. When our life is filled with all of those gifts of the Spirit and fruits of the Spirit, we're now in a total place of peace, and we're in the sacred embrace, which was the embrace of holiness or oneness. So the judgment is, how do you match yourself with choice, mercy, charity, and peace? That's what you're being judged by. And then we come to the place of theosis. So this figure standing in the center has 2 roles. She's representing Adam and Eve that's leaving the Garden of Eden. She's got the fig leaves covering her sexual organs. That's Adam and Eve being expelled from the Garden of Eden. But this is also them coming back. And this is what it looks like. And this is why she's got a robe and why she's got a scepter. I will greatly rejoice in the Lord. My soul shall be joyful in my God, for he has clothed me in the garments of salvation. He has covered me with the robe of righteousness. In other words, purity of heart. I have done everything that I can to be pure in heart, but at the end of the day, it's about the fact that I'm covered in the robe of righteousness by the divine, by infinite being. And that's what allows me to enter back into the presence of God, back into that place of undifferentiated consciousness. A scepter of righteousness is the scepter of the kingdom. So once again, here we have righteousness. This is purity of heart. We're in such a place of purity of heart that we have the robe of righteousness and we have the scepter of righteousness, which are the 2 qualities that we need to fully enter back into the presence of God. And we talk about that in more detail in the program. Not the old card, but in the new card, they also had a vial, a container. And this was interesting. You love righteousness and hate sickness. Therefore, God, thy God, has anointed you with an oil of gladness. And that's what she's carrying, is the oil of gladness. In other words, we have found supreme happiness. And do you know what the word beatitude means? Supreme happiness. These Beatitudes are the journey that we can have supreme happiness as a way of life, as a way of being. And that's the point at which us in our Christ consciousness becomes one with the Father. Jesus said, become one like I and the Father are one. He did that through becoming the Christ. As we become the Christ, which we can do, we become one with the Father. And that's all symbolic language, of course. Now, just to throw a spin on the matter, I'm going to quote a Hindu poet, Akka Mahadevi, 12th century Hindu poet. And this is what Akka had to say. When my body became you, in other words, I fully immersed who I was physically to serving you, there was no one else to serve but you. When my mind became you, there was none else I could call upon. After my own consciousness was lost in you, I became so immersed in love, there was nothing else to know. Losing myself in you, you and I ceased to exist. Because in that place, all there was oneness, infinite being. Losing myself in you, you and I cease to exist. The end. And look at that, it's 9 o'clock. This is huge in terms of what it represents, but it's achievable. It's something that we can integrate and have as part of our reality, as part of our experience. And these amazing people, these Cathar, back in the 13th and 14th century, understood this. This is why they were known as the good Christians, Bonhomme and Bonfemme. And they were able to fully adopt that as a way of life. And they gave us the tools to do it. And this is what I discovered. So here's what I'd like to suggest to you. Please go onto the website. You'll get an invitation to do it. And on that website, there'll be an opportunity for you to go and check out the programs that we have around this. So the programs, you can either do it as a self-paced program, which we only charge $290 for, and the website is just russellsturgess.com.au, RUSSELL Sturgess.com.au. Thanks, Teagues. And go in there. You can do a self-paced thing over 16 sessions, which is a recording of a program that I did previously with people. We also have a group, one starting where you can come and join in at a group, which is set at about $890 or $900 around that, which goes for 16 weeks as a group with me online. Or you can do one-on-one, which its top price is $3,000, but we've got heaps and heaps of, well, not heaps, but there's options for you to pay them off. So if you want to do it and you'd like to be able to pay them off, we've got monthly and weekly options over 12 months or a few months and different things like that. You can see all of that on my page. That's my sell, is that last minute or 2 minutes. I hope that this has been, and please put your microphones back on. I hope that it's probably nothing like you're expecting was going to happen tonight, but I hope that it's been something that has given you lots of things to think about, lots of tools to consider as tools that you can incorporate into your experience. I've tried to give you as much as I can in such a very, very short period of time.